All right, let's jump right in. Have you ever picked up the Christian Bible and wondered, what's the one big story here? I mean, it's a huge book, right? Well, the source material we're looking at today presents it as just that, one single epic story, a narrative that stretches over 4,000 years, all built around a single unfolding promise. And, the source we're pulling from kicks things off with this incredible quote. It's basically saying, hey, listen up. This isn't just a bunch of random stories. This is one story, and it's all true. It sets this epic, almost cinematic tone, right? And, of course, a story this big has to start, well, at the very beginning. Okay, so think about any great story you love. It always has a central problem, right? A conflict that gets everything moving. And this story's no different. It sets up the stakes right from the get-go. We start with a perfect world, but it gets broken. And that brokenness, well, that creates the need for a promised solution. So, picture this. The story opens in paradise, literally. God creates this perfect world, a beautiful garden, and in it, he puts the first two people, Adam and Eve. I mean, we're talking no sin, no death, no pain. They just hang out with God, walking and talking with him. It's perfect. And this is where we get to the first major turning point. It all boils down to a single choice. God gives them just one rule, one boundary. Don't eat from this one tree. If you do, you'll die. Super clear, right? But then the villain enters the story, a serpent, and he offers this tantalizing twist. He says, nah, you won't die. In fact, you'll be like gods. And, well, Adam and Eve, they go for it. They believe the lie. And just like that, everything changes. The perfect world is shattered. Sin and death are now part of the human story. It's a disaster. But, and this is so important for the rest of the narrative, in the middle of all this bad news, God makes a really mysterious promise. He looks at the serpent and says that one day, a child of the woman, her seed, is going to come and crush his head. It's the very first glimmer of hope, the first thread of this promise that's going to stretch across the next 4,000 years. So, okay, a promise is made, but how do you keep a promise like that alive for thousands of years? Well, the next part of the story is all about how this promise was protected and passed down, almost like a family heirloom, through a very specific group of people, its guardians or custodians. And you can see the story just jumps forward in these huge leaps of time. First up, you've got Noah. The world gets so bad that it's wiped out by a flood, but God saves Noah and his family to preserve that promised bloodline. Then, fast forward a few hundred years, and the promise gets way more specific. God zeroes in on one guy, Abraham, and says it's through your family, the rescuer will come from you. Then bam, hundreds of years later, Abraham's family has exploded into a whole nation, Israel, and Moses steps in to lead them out of slavery. Now, the way God makes this promise official is through something called a covenant. The easiest way to think of it is like a super serious binding contract. It's an agreement. God basically says, I'll be your God, and I'll bring this Redeemer through you. And their side of the deal is to follow his ways and hold on to that hope, to keep that promise front and center. For a long, long time, this promise was kind of vague, someone is coming. But then things start to get interesting. During the era of Israel's kings, a whole bunch of people called prophets start showing up, and they begin to add these incredibly specific details to the picture. It's like a fuzzy image slowly coming into sharp focus. And what we end up with is basically a prophetic checklist. I mean, look at this stuff. These predictions were made hundreds of years before the fact. He'd be born of a virgin. He'd be born in a tiny specific town called Bethlehem. He'd be a direct descendant of the great King David. But then you get these other kind of weird and dark predictions, like his hands and feet would be pierced. It's a strange and super detailed resume for a king, right? And then, nothing. Complete radio silence. For 400 years, the prophets stop speaking. Can you imagine? The checklist is complete, the prophecies are all there, and then, just waiting. The entire nation is holding its breath. And the massive question hanging in the air is, who on earth could possibly show up and check every single one of these boxes? And that's when the story makes its most important turn. The spotlight lands on one person, Jesus of Nazareth. The entire narrative from this point forward is about showing how his life, his birth, his teachings, his death, all of it was the direct fulfillment of that 4,000-year-old promise. He's presented as the one who finally checks all the boxes. Just let that sink in for a second. 4,000 years. That's the sheer scale we're dealing with here. We're talking about a single promise passed down through something like 200 generations. It's this one unbroken thread woven through history, all leading up to this single person, this single moment. So when Jesus finally starts teaching, his message is, well, it's totally radical. People were expecting a warrior king, someone to overthrow the Romans. But that's not what they got. Instead, he starts talking about loving your enemies, forgiving people who wrong you, focusing on what's inside your heart, not just on religious rules. It was completely upside down from what everyone was expecting. And it wasn't just his words that were powerful, it was his actions. He starts performing these incredible miracles. Like one time, he takes a kid's lunch, just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and feeds a crowd of over 5,000 people. It was a massive sign, a throwback to the stories of God feeding their ancestors in the desert. Another time, he heals a man who was born blind. And for the people watching, this wasn't just a random act of kindness. It was a huge deal. It was a direct checkmark on that prophetic checklist. The prophets had said the Messiah would make the blind see, and here he was, doing it right in front of them. So, as you can probably guess, not everyone was thrilled about this. All these miracles and his claims to be from God, it put him on a direct collision course with the religious authorities. To them, he wasn't the promised king. He was a troublemaker, a massive threat to their control. And that conflict, it sets the stage for the story's climax. And the whole thing comes to a breaking point over his friend, a man named Lazarus. Lazarus gets sick and dies, and this becomes the ultimate challenge. Okay, so Jesus has shown he has power over sickness, over nature, but what about the big one? What about death itself? And the way this plays out is just full of drama. Jesus actually waits. He doesn't show up until Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. I mean, he's really dead. Then Jesus gets to the tomb, tells him to roll away the stone, and he just shouts, "Lazarus, come out." And then he does. The man who was dead and buried for 4 days just walks out, alive. This one miracle draws a line in the sand. There is no middle ground anymore. For the people who supported him, this was it, the final proof. This guy has to be the Son of God. But for his enemies, this was the last straw. They're thinking, if we let this continue, we lose everything. And right then and there, the plot to kill him becomes official. Now, Jesus knows they're plotting to kill him, so what does he do? He doesn't run, he doesn't hide. No, just a few days later, he rides straight into the heart of the capital, Jerusalem. He rides in on a donkey, which, by the way, checks off another prophecy, and the crowds go wild, shouting and celebrating him as their king, right under the noses of the people who want him dead. And that's where we're left, with this massive tension. The promised king, the one they've waited 4,000 years for, is here. He's proven he has power over death itself. And yet, he's not headed for a throne, he's headed for a trial. So the big question is, how does the hero who was promised to crush evil end up on a Roman cross? That's the paradox the rest of the story has to solve.